Okay, hi, I'm Sensei Mui, broadcasting live from TSA in beautiful Wheaton, Illinois. This is the sixth class of the 10 Perfections class, and so we've only got 2 more to go, and it's starting to get complicated now. Well, not complicated so much as more in depth. Last week, I ended sounding a little bit like I was dismissing emotions offhand, and that's not true. Emotions are extraordinarily important to not only the Buddhist path, but also the path of just being a human being. Emotions, while having no reality in and of themselves as far as the great scheme of things is concerned, at the time that we're experiencing an emotion is extraordinarily real. It's extraordinarily valid. And it's valid because it affects our karma, or karma, if you're of the Sanskrit persuasion. The thing about emotions is that they are probably, without a doubt, the one characteristic of being human that keeps us in darkness. Now, the word that we normally translate as ignorance doesn't mean ignorance, as I've said consistently in just about every one of these classes. Buddhism is plagued with bad translation. The word that is translated as ignorance is avijja, and that means not seeing. And because we're not seeing correctly, we can be called blinded. And what blindsides us most often is our emotions. And they can range from the very, very subtle to the very, very intense. And some of the more intense emotions that we feel are love, hate, fear. And some of the subtler ones are like anxiety, desires that sort of verge on but aren't quite into greed. And they're all very egocentric. They all have something to do with the ego. So why are we talking about emotions when we should be talking about satcha? Truthfulness, honesty, reality, transparency. Well, that's because our emotions tend to act as a veil. They hide things from us. I had an interesting experience today where I had not realized that I was stressed because I was in proximity of a place where I used to work, and I had a bad experience there. And the emotional experience of that was so subtle that I missed it entirely. I didn't realize that it was having an effect on me, and all my old karmas just came right up. And even though I looked cool and I looked calm and I looked collected, the stress was still there. And because of that stress, I found myself in an attitude that I probably should not have had, and that was probably not the best thing in the world for me to do. But be that as it may, I have a friend that pointed that out to me. She used a term that would be inappropriate for me to use on a webinar to describe my attitude, my actions. But I had to bring that up because emotion is the thing that stops us from gaining happiness, peace, and freedom. Even when we think we're being happy, there's this underlying thing called dukkha madukkha, the suffering of suffering, the stress of stress. Because when we're enjoying things, we know they can't last. Eventually they have to implode, and hard times come again. So we're going to talk about satcha, and if I can wade through this material fast enough, we'll talk about atitana, Aditana meaning determination, resoluteness, ardency, and often, very often, expressed as a vow. In Theravadan Buddhism, the original or the oldest form of Buddhism, and in the original Pali Canon, the oldest teachings that we have, it's called a training precept, not a vow. In Mahayana, the newer version of Buddhism, which is the predominant version in East Asia and Northern Asia, it's referred to as a vow, where they actually take a vow. And in Tibet, at least, they feel that a physical shell forms around you, which sort of deflects bad karma and demons and such like, which sounds pretty cool. Not really sure that it works that way, but it sounds pretty cool. Okay, Satya, continued from class 5. Are we honest with others? Are we honest with ourselves? And what does it mean to be honest? Well, if we're not honest with ourselves, how would we know? We're only aware of what honesty is or isn't when we are deliberately being untruthful. Then we know what honesty is. But when we're being dishonest with ourselves, it's very, very difficult to see. Just as reality cannot be experienced while delusion exists, because delusion is hiding the truth from us, truthfulness cannot manifest while dishonesty is present. And emotion is the meaning we give to our felt states of arousal. And it's a way of being somewhat dishonest about what is actually going on. And it's not dishonest in that it's a blatant out-and-out lie. Where the dishonesty comes in is that there's a lack of transparency. We can't see through this veil of emotional and mental trips we put ourselves through. Now, psychologists consider emotions to be a complex state involving diverse aspects. Well, the Buddha would have said the same too. An emotion in Buddhism is the thought complex that we build around the sensation of pleasure or displeasure. In modern psychology, an emotion is a physiological state of arousal, first of all. There's always a somatic dimension to emotion: queasy stomach, rise in blood pressure, maybe higher blood pressure, the brain squirting out dopamine or adrenaline, depending on the emotional state. It also involves an object which has significance, a sense of value to the person experiencing the emotion. This becomes significant because we actually require some sort of stimuli to arouse an emotion, because it becomes, well, it has to do with the ego, and the ego responds really well to physical stimuli, whether that stimuli is something we see, something we hear, something we touch, something we've smelled. How often do smells bring back childhood memories? I was in a cafe in Evanston, Illinois, Monday, or Saturday, excuse me, and they were making chocolate chip cookies. Suddenly, every wonderful thought I ever had as a child came raising up to my brain, and I was hungry for chocolate chip cookies all the rest of the day. I settled for bacon. Emotions are dynamically fed by our drives and dispositions. That means whatever we're after or trying to avoid, our emotion plays into that. It becomes a stimulus itself, which drives us toward or drives us away from whatever it is we're trying to get. And our psychological and emotional disposition to begin with creates the emotions that determines the emotions that we're going to feel. And they're always interlocked with other emotions. Love almost always has a sense of fear underlying it. Fear almost always has a sense of anger underlying it. Anger always has fear underlying it. So there's this interrelationship of emotions. They interlock somehow. And if you do mindfulness practice where you're watching the thoughts within the thoughts, the feelings within the feelings, the quality of mind within the qualities of mind, you really get to see this on a very personal level. Even good experiences have underneath it, mixed in with it, something that is not pleasant. They're also related to an individual's belief. Now, I think one of the new or newer catchphrases in society today is belief systems. I'm not sure that belief system is really a way to explain what the beliefs that we have are. I'm not quite sure that that's systematic. Sometimes they seem pretty random. But our emotions are very, very closely tied to whatever it is we're believing at the time that we have the emotion. It's like a person that says, that's experiencing unrequited love, where they feel that there's something wrong with the other person because they're not returning the affection that they wish they had. And the underlying belief there is, I deserve to be loved, and if this person doesn't love me, then there's something wrong with them. And it's usually on the physical level rather than an emotional one. Possesses a wide-ranging network of symbols and cultural ethos of a society. Well, of course it does. There are a lot of people that feel emotional about the flag, the American flag. There are some people that feel emotional about owning a gun. There's because it's in the Constitution and they feel they have a right to own one. There are other people that feel very emotional if they get within 10 feet of a Bible, for instance. Emotion is very, very much tied into our culture and to the ethic of the culture. There's certain cultures in Africa, for instance, that it's a desert culture. I believe it's what used to be called Nubia. I don't know if it's still called Nubia. Southern Egypt, very far south of Egypt, where the ethos of the community is who can lie the best and get away with it, where honesty is not treasured, lying is treasured and highly regarded. So their ethical system has a large impact on what kind of emotional response they have to certain stimuli. Much, much different than ours. A person growing up in a Vietnamese community in Vietnam will have different emotional responses than an American growing up in Austin, Texas, for instance, because the cultural values are somewhat different. Okay, that's all Psychology 101, and we already knew that. It's just good for review. Now, it all has to do with attraction and aversion, and this is where the Buddhism comes into play. An emotion occurs when an object is considered as something attractive or repulsive. We get these emotional stimuli. If I'm attracted to it, I love it. I love bacon. I love bacon on pizza. I also love ice cream. I really am repulsed by the idea of putting a scoop of ice cream on a bacon pizza, though. Somehow that doesn't sound good to me. It gets all syrupy and stuff. So there's attraction and there's repulsion about things that I'm attracted to. It's just the combination didn't work out too well. There's also a tendency impelling, actually driving one towards suitable objects, which they find pleasurable, but repelling them from objects that they find unsuitable, unpleasurable, or even harmful. I don't think much more needs to be said about that. But we also perceive and judge the situation in relationship to ourselves, whether it is attractive or repulsive. Somebody came up to me today and offered me a Dhamma center, a retreat center where I could teach Buddhism and have yoga instructors there and physical therapists, and we could do all these really cool meditation retreats. I would be automatically attracted to that, but if somebody offered me a butcher shop, I might be repulsed by that. Because of the situation, how I see myself. I see myself in one way, others might see me in another, others certainly do see me in another way. Can't help that. Not everybody's going to love us, not everybody's going to hate us. So we see ourselves as one thing, others almost always see us a little bit differently. Attraction, sarajati, we have attraction for agreeable material objects, shapes, forms. I was with a student on Saturday and he had to chuckle because this attractive woman walked by and I did a double take. I may be a monk, I may be happy with it, but I'm not dead. There are some things which are aesthetically pleasing that I have to look at twice. There are other things that I find repugnant, bhayapajati, and those disagreeable material shapes, oddly enough, give me the same response physically. I have to do a double take. Whenever we see something disagreeable, we, for some reason, cannot take our eyes off of it. There's a fascination with the agreeable and there's a fascination with the disagreeable. That's just the way we're made. And we have to get used to that fact. An individual possessed of like and dislike approach pleasure-giving objects and try to avoid painful objects. This is absolutely normal. Now, the Buddha recognized that and he approached all human emotion from that factor. That was part of his genius. It's very simple being a human being. It's very simple to be a living being of any kind. Even bacteria in water will try to avoid pain and will be attracted to pleasurable things. Cats do it, birds do it, wasps do it, mosquitoes do it. No reason why you and I shouldn't do it as well. It's a natural response. So we live constantly with this pleasure-pain principle. Pleasant feelings and painful feelings. They are both affective reactions to sensations. In other words, they affect us. They affect how we respond to things. They affect how we deal with them, what sort of thought forms arise in our itty-bitty little minds that want us to respond in one way or another. Judgment, in terms of these, well, I've got here hedonic tone. Okay, this pleasure principle, fancy way of saying pleasure. We get excited. And it creates in us a disposition to possess the object if we like it. And that's called greed. We want nice stuff. Or if we have a decided hatred toward it, we actually want to destroy it. Some people are terrified of flying insects. And the first thing they want to do, instead of escorting the bug out, they want to kill it. To flee from it in fear is a normal response as well. Or we get obsessed about something and we worry over it, and we call this anxiety. Now, how we responded in the past influences how we're going to respond in the present to these oncoming stimuli. And they're often rooted in the dynamics of our own personality. How, again, we see ourselves. How, again, we see how we ought to respond to something. Most people don't like spiders, so they squish them. Most people don't like snakes, so they avoid them. It becomes embedded in our personality. Somebody has a physical characteristic that reminds us of a snake, we try to avoid them as well. It's all very very plain and very clear. I think I mentioned here how I was very angry with a guy one time that I was supposed to be interviewing for a position, and I had no idea. I never met the guy before, but I took an immediate dislike for him. Then it turned out to be his haircut. He reminded me of my high school gym instructor, whom I didn't like at all. And this was the only reason I didn't like the guy in the present. He reminded me of somebody from my past. I had that response to that haircut when I was like 14. Still had that response at 54. Anusaya, proclivity. And proclivity means that we create our own vicious cycle. That's not its technical meaning, that's just the way it works. As emotions emerge, they're based upon our deep-rooted tendencies to do one thing or another, to like one kind of thing or dislike another kind of thing. The pleasant feelings induce an attachment to pleasant objects because they arouse latent sensuous greed. Raga nusaya. Painful feelings arouse latent anger and hatred. States like pride, jealousy, elation, etc. are also these kinds of proclivities that put us in these vicious cycles of pleasure, pain, ups and downs, making our life a constant roller coaster ride. These tendencies make us lean toward what we perceive as pleasurable, and yet create a malevolence in us constantly. And these tendencies seem to be at work even in infancy. Almost as soon as a baby is able to experience, they develop these tendencies immediately. And that's because it's normal for all living things. 6 roots of motivation. Motivation. Motivation is one of the driving forces behind emotions. We have emotions because we are motivated. And these motivations, these mula, fall into 2 distinct categories, wholesome and unwholesome. The unwholesome ones are greed, hatred, and delusion. The wholesome ones are the opposite. No greed, no hatred, no delusion. Very, very simple. And that pretty much covers all of our motivations right there in 6 pieces. You don't need to spend a whole lot of money on psychotherapy to figure that out. Okay, there we go. Greed and hatred. Greed generates the way we approach desires, and they come in the form of self-preservation and the drive for sensuous pursuits. There are people that cannot accumulate enough money. They have to keep accumulating money. They're working from a position of poverty. Even if they have $1 bazillion in the bank, they're still working from the point of view that they exist in poverty. self-preservation. The more money they have, the better they feel their chances of survival are. But there's another self there that is being preserved, and that's the self that sees themselves as a wealthy individual, an individual of importance, an individual of stature, an individual with more money than anybody else. Now, sometimes this wealth leads to sensuous pursuits, but very often not. I was reading a statistic online. It came from Huffington Post. A person that makes, okay, what was this? It was something to the effect of a person who makes $1 billion still has the same household budget for his individual family as far as food, electricity, and all that is concerned as a person who makes $100,000. There's a point where there can be too much wealth, because then we're accumulating wealth simply to preserve the self. It goes beyond self-preservation as a living organism. Now, hatred, on the other hand, generates avoidance desires in the form of a drive to annihilate and leads to aggressive tendencies. With hatred, a very, very mild form of hatred is called ill will. It's where I desire that somebody else suffer, but I don't take any action. I just send this wish out into the universe, you know, may they get stepped on by King Kong. I'm not going to go out and hire King Kong to step on them, because that would be bad. But it's okay to feel like they ought to be stepped on by King Kong. Somehow we can justify this. Somehow we can justify adding fuel to the fire, even if the fire is very, very small. This is a quote from Nyanaponika Thera. It's from his book, The Abhidhamma Studies, which is a brilliant work if you're into Buddhist psychology. But basically what he is saying here is that non-greed and non-hate may, according to the particular case, have either a mainly negative meaning signifying absence of greed and hate, or they may possess a distinctly positive character. For example, non-greed as renunciation and liberality, non-hate as enmity, kindness, and forbearance. So what he's actually trying to say here in plain English is that when we're feeling in the absence of greed and in the absence of hate, we can either express that as not taking hate-filled actions or not taking greedy actions, which is the negative form. We're just not doing it. Or there's a positive form of that where we say, you know what, I'm not greedy, I am generous instead. I am not hateful, I am I am life affirming. And these are things that, these are the two aspects of the greed and hatred thing. We can either be passively peaceful or we can be actively peaceful. And that's from the Abhidhamma. Our range of emotions is limited to the psychodynamics of emotional states. Now that sounds pretty reasonable. We only feel emotions within the guidelines of the emotional state. That's all we generally recognize. Again, if we practice mindfulness, we'll see just how complex this really is. But on the surface, when we're conscious of an emotion arising like love, we feel all these frilly little butterflies floating around in our heart, and we feel so good, and we feel nothing but compassion and caring and how wonderful this other person is. And we're not noticing how angry we are at the parking ticket we got this morning. We can only feel emotion within the context of the emotion itself. Although there is significant range of factors that emerging out of our socioeconomic structure. Yes, there was a study done of the Congo River. You're wondering what this has to do with emotion. Well, as it turns out, the Congo River was at one time a lake. And the population of monkeys around the lake were pretty homogeneous. I mean, they all had the same resources. They lived in peace. They were quite comfortable living with each other. As the lake shrunk and the lake became a river, the Congo River, an interesting thing happened. Microclimates formed. On the north side of the river, it became lush, green, lots of resources. On the south side of the river, drought conditions. There were very little resources. There were rocky ground, nothing much would grow there. And what they discovered was the monkeys that lived in the resource plentiful area lived in peace and harmony. They shared everything. The monkeys on the south side, where there was where they were literally poverty-stricken as far as resources were concerned, were constantly at war, constantly fighting each other, constantly stealing from one another, did not live a very peaceful life. How very human is that? In the Chicago area, we have Highland Park in the north. Very, very little violence. Very, very little fighting going on. Very, very little shooting and gun deaths. Yet you go south to the Hyde Park or Kimbark area, you get a lot more violence because resources are scarce. Unemployment is high. Food deserts are in a lot of those areas. So the same kind of principle evolves. How we emote often depends on our social and economic position. People who are less educated tend to fight more than people that are more educated. Is something that's very common in the world today. Different economic and social structures stimulate different types of psychological drives. Yeah. It was pointed out to me once that drug dealers living in poverty areas, usually with one ethnic group dominating, tend to be entrepreneurs. They sell drugs because that's all they've got to make money off of. Whereas in other socioeconomic social structures, people tend to become lawyers or hedge fund managers and things of this sort, where they have a lot more opportunity available to them. And oddly enough, even when the socioeconomic conditions change, even dramatically and suddenly, the character structure of the individuals changes very slowly. We live in a country that had a significant portion of its history built around slave ownership and not very pleasant race relations. Now, as I recall, slaves were freed 140 plus years ago, and yet the racial tension still exists. Things take time to change. And emotions are codependent. Well, a lot like a lot of couples I've run into lately. Not you guys. I'm thinking about somebody else right now. Desires are dependent on social structures for nourishment and existence. There are desires to save and hoard. We talked about the wealthy person whose wealth is never enough. Well, what about the average person that feels like, wow, they may run out? So they'll go out and buy 200 rolls of toilet paper. And when they get down to about 120, they'll buy another 200 rolls of toilet paper. There's the desire to have, the desire to save, the desire not to run short of the things we feel are necessary. There's the desire to protect and accumulate what we have. Then to spend and consume, to share and to sacrifice. All these things are co-dependent. When we share, we tend to feel that we're making a sacrifice of some kind. And we live in a spend and consume society, and there's some really intricate psychodynamics going on with that. There is a really interesting phenomena that the cultural history of any community tends to determine how they approach life. For instance, in the West, we live on a very biblically based community. Judaism, Christianity, Judeo-Christianity, whatever that is, and Islam even are very important factors in our society because they tend to see the world from the same point of view. This will determine, in a lot of instances, how they respond to the same stimuli. Other peoples, now by definition, if you're not Bible-based, you therefore must be pagan, like we Buddhists, and then there's Wiccans and shamans and so forth. Their outlook will be very, very different. Things that are important to Reverend Bob in Skokie may be very, very different than the things that are important to Venerable Mui in Evanston, just because of our viewpoint of life is different. Nobody ever told me to go out and have dominion over the earth. As a matter of fact, I was told kind of to coexist with it. Other people feel that they have dominion, where they can do things like re-landscape for aesthetic purposes rather than re-landscape for ecological purposes. And it's always interesting to see how these beliefs play into the role of emotion. The emergence of greed and hatred or compassion and sympathy is often related to the value system of a society. We live in a society where we're very easily compassionate toward one group, not very easily compassionate toward another. We pick and choose who deserves compassion. We pick and choose who deserves loving kindness. The whole thrust of the Buddhist practice is to be compassionate and kind and sympathetic toward everybody regardless of who they are. In other communities, certain people don't deserve compassion or loving kindness. We can drop bombs on them, but they don't deserve our compassion. There are 4 types of situations where the nature of emotion is discussed in the Pali Canon. And these are 4 of them, and they're divided into unskillful and skillful. Emotions obstructing the ideal of a good life sought by a layman. What does a layperson want most out of life? Happiness, peace, and freedom. That can take a lot of different shapes and forms. Sometimes our emotions get in the way. They get in the way of our happiness. For sure, whenever we're angry, there cannot coexist happiness at the same time. Emotions also interfere with the recluse or monastic or hermit or yogi or whatever title we want to give them. Well, they can interfere with them on the successful completion of their path to perfection. That is total understanding. And these are 2 unskillful things that emotion brings in. Now, the skillful use of emotions brings us enhancement of our practice, where it becomes easier to be happy, easier to be more at peace, easier to be free. And then emotions developed by the recluse helps them or her get to that point of arahantship or enlightenment. And so emotions can play a beneficial as well as a detrimental role. let's not just badmouth emotions all night long. They do have a significant value, and they can bring us closer to peace and happiness if we use them skillfully and if we're not caught up with them. Because in a sense, when we let our emotions run away with us, we start doing time. We become a prisoner to them. And it's very, very difficult to escape once you're wrapped up in the tight fist of desire, greed, self-preservation, fear. Western psychology sees undesirable emotions as those that create problems of adjustment. Somebody having trouble adjusting to the norms of society because of the way they're emoting, the way they feel. They can, unhealthy emotions can impair our mental health. Morbid grief is one that comes to mind immediately. A person could be so overwhelmed by the loss of someone or something they thought was important to them, or had realized were important to them while they possessed them. And once they're gone, they just cannot get over the loss. And this interferes not just with the way they function within society, but it also interferes with the way they see themselves and society. Those desirable emotions are valuable as adaptive resources. So when we're having a good emotion, a good emotional response, we find it easier to adapt. Okay. Delineation of mental health merely in terms of adjustment is really questionable. It's being questioned by psychologists, and it's being questioned by actually people in the religious fields. New trends are emerging in that thought. And the gap between the psychology of Buddhism and the psychology of the West is actually narrowing as we step back from the adaptive view or adjustment view of Western psychology. Emotions are a lot more complex than that. Fear, probably the most sensationalized emotion that there can be. I used to watch, I get a kick out of 1930s and 1940s movies, and especially monster movies from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, because love is the dominant theme in all of these movies. I mean, even the werewolf, in one sense or another, poor old Lon Chaney Jr. is a victim of love. Right, and it's all about this unrequited love. Frankenstein is a lover, not a fighter. The monster, at any way, the doctor is usually Looney Tunes. Well, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it started shifting, where the love story was much less important. If you've ever seen the movie Alien, which made Sigourney Weaver famous, there is no love plot in that whatsoever. It's all about being scared. To death. Okay, I had a mental block there of what I was being scared of. Man, it's a very scary movie. And people love scary movies because adrenaline flows. Our society has made kind of a switch from the romantic comedy view of the supernatural and monsters and so forth into a darker side, a much darker side. And I'll talk about this a little bit more later. It has to do with breaking taboos, living on the edge. And it's very important to our society to be afraid. In the last, 12, 13 years, we've been told to be afraid. Very afraid. There are terrorists in the closet. There are terrorists in the kitchen. They're lurking around in the bathroom linen closet. We're constantly told to be afraid. We've gotten used to it somehow. Now we're afraid of each other. Even when we look alike, we're still afraid of each other. Fear is supposed to arise as a response to danger, which is specific in nature. Anxiety, on the other hand, is a reaction to a danger which is not clearly articulated. During the Cold War era in the United States, and probably the rest of the civilized world, we had anxiety about an unknown fear. Today, we're very afraid. We know exactly what it is we're afraid of. We're afraid of everybody else. Why gun sales are up. Fewer people are buying guns, but the people that are buying guns are buying a lot. They're terrified. Both the nature and the object of one's attitude to the danger is not recognized. In anxiety, you can't point to what it is you're afraid of. In fear, it's very, very definite. They're both called bhaya in Pali, which makes the distinction within the context of how this bhaya is seen. But it can mean fear, fright, or dread. There are two situations which cause fear. There is the consequence of the strong desire to either persons or things. We want something or someone so badly we are terrified of losing them. Or we want something very, very badly. We are terrified at losing the opportunity to have it. It's like that person experiencing unrequited love. They become terrified that the other person, the object of their desire, does not love them, and they're afraid of losing the opportunity to love them. And this often manifests as frustration and anger. There is also the fear which is caused as a consequence of leading an undesirable life. This is the fear of getting caught, of paying the price for what we have done wrong in the past. Why do people not break laws? According to Senator Rand Paul, it's because we're all afraid of getting caught. That's why we don't break laws. If we knew we could get away with it, we'd probably break laws more often. I doubt that very much. I think people are basically educated and willing to be good. Leading an undesirable life is something that most of us would shun just because it's a good idea. Just because we're social animals, we're cooperative. But there is a point of view that would hold that we fear consequences more than we enjoy being nice people. There's the problem of attachment. Strong attachment to people or things leads to a sense that we have to defend these people or things against loss or theft. Concern for the well-being of the object of our affection or desire turns into a fear of loss. The possibility of death causes anguish and anxiety if you've been with someone for a long time. We see this not only with people, but with our pets as well. And it's the same with the attachment to one's own self. Our attachment to ourselves not only makes us fearful of our own death, our own mortality, but also sickness, which is very normal, the threat of losing one's job or reputation, which happens every day. We become very, very fearful of losing our good name, as if we had one to begin with. Again, The way we see ourselves may not be the way others see us. What I see is this dude here. I like to see myself as this kind of a person, but this is the way other people probably see me. I'm very aware of that. I would love to see myself as a holy person 24/7. Unfortunately, sometimes I'm a dog about it, and I'll be the first to admit that. It's a practice. They only call it a perfection. Self-preservation's, this drive is fed by the lurking tendency to crave for existence. The fear becomes an agitating condition. When we're not just trying to save our lives or trying to save our reputations, the way we see each other, the way we want to be seen, we want others to see us as we want to be seen. Even if we know it's not true, we still want other people to see us that way. Like, I want to be seen as a young Sean Connery. Well, at least younger than me. But I don't. I look like this. Big difference. Self-preservation includes this desire to save who we think we are. Includes the desire for power. If you see me the way I want to be seen, then I'll have power over you. There's lust, which is craving. Jealousy, because other people might be the way I want to see myself, and I want you to see me. And there's pride. If you do see me that way, wow, I got away with some. I am that person. And they're all intimately related to this emergence of fear. These emotions are interlocked with other emotions. Pride is interlocked with fear. Jealousy interlocked with fear. Desire interlocked with fear. And they're all interlocked with each other. They all have to do with power, greed, desire, and fear. In the consequence of an undesirable life, there's a fear related to emotion of guilt. And yes, guilt is an emotion. It can be unhealthy, destructive, but it also can be healthy and productive. When it becomes a pathological sense of remorse, it has a debilitating effect, creating worry and restlessness in the way we interact with others. Because if I'm feeling a lot of guilt for something I did in the past, then I'm not worthy of the good things I'm getting in the present, because I'm so guilty of what I've done. I'm in a unique position as a meditator, in that while I have probably 100,000 regrets linked to my past, I have very little guilt. I would not change any decision I have ever made, no matter how bad the outcome, because I'm very, very happy with the way things worked out. I'm happy with my home life. I'm happy with what I do for a living. I'm happy with my practice. And that would not have happened this way were it not for all of the things that I've done prior to this. That's why I do feel regret, but very little remorse. A healthy sense of moral dread and shame. Moral dread, hiri, and shame, otapa, prevents us from taking on an evil life and turns the basis of responsibility and a sense of civic duty right back on us. We're responsible for the happiness of others. If we live our lives appropriately, pay attention to what we're doing, live without ill will, live with intentional harmlessness, then nobody will ever suffer directly from our actions, from our speech, or from our thoughts. It's a very, very interesting proposition, which I found to be true. The happiness of others is my responsibility. I can't blame myself if they're not happy, but I have to behave and live in such a way that is harmless to others. Hence, becomes my responsibility. Okay, the difference between fear and anxiety, we have to make a distinction. Fear is the response to a specific situation or a particular object. It is specific, demonstrable, and there is empirical evidence that something is going to do us harm. Dread, anxiety, is objectless, diffuse, and vague. In Buddhism, we actually have a term for that. It's called dukkha dukkha. It is the stress of stress. You have three kinds of dukkha. The first dukkha, okay, let's use this term suffering, just to make the translators happy. You have acute suffering. I walk into the room and I stub my ingrown toenail on a chair. That's acute suffering. Or the person that I love very much says they're going to leave me in the morning for another man. Ah! That is acute suffering. Then there is chronic suffering. Let's go back to the ingrown toenail. It gets infected and it stays infected for a couple of weeks, causing a throbbing pain. That is a chronic kind of suffering. Okay? My spouse is cheating on me and has been cheating on me for years, and I know it, and it causes me stress, but there's not much I'm going to do about it. This is chronic suffering. Going into a job that you hate and you've been going there for years, this is chronic suffering. Now there's another kind of suffering. The third kind is the suffering of suffering. That's when you're constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop. Knowing that something is not quite right. And sooner or later, it's going to blow up on us. We know this is going to happen. And this is where anxiety comes in. Anxiety is egocentric. It's egocentric because we're the only ones feeling it. Other people have their egocentricities and their dreads. Rich people have rich people's dreads. Poor people have poor people's dreads. People living on the north side of Chicago have north side dreads. People living on the south side of Chicago have south side dreads. We all have our own unique things that we feel anxious about, but we can't put a finger on what it is. Some anxieties are vague apprehensions which seem unclear on the surface. When we scratch that surface, we find specific fears underneath them. A pretty bland example of that is a person about ready to get married might feel, ooh, there's going to be financial problems. Can I afford this? Is this marriage going to be successful? Wow. Do we want children? Do they want children? I don't want children. And we can go on and on and on and on and keep finding specific fears underneath this vague apprehension about getting married. Under analysis, many forms of anxiety can be uncovered this way. This is why we do mindfulness practice. But in any case, the basic type of anxiety that we have is our deep-rooted attachment to the ego causing it. A type of concealed suffering which lies behind much of everyday apprehensions. We're attached to who we think we are. We're attached to who we want to be. But it doesn't work. There's cognitive dissonance. I see myself as fill in the blank, but my life demonstrates that I'm not that thing that I want to be. This causes a great deal of anxiety and tension in one's life. From the basic nature of the human condition, there is the fear that we will lose our self-esteem, our self-respect. Others will stop respecting us. And this anxiety is inseparable from our attachment of how we view ourselves. It's a built-in anxiety. And what makes it even worse is when we don't know what we want to be when we grow up. That hurts us the worst. When we find ourselves in a position where we don't know what our skill set is. We don't know what it is we want to do with the rest of our lives. We know we want to do something valuable, something significant, but we don't know where our talents lie. And this anxiety can be paralyzing. It can lead to depression. It can lead to physical ailments. And this is one kind of emotion we as integrated human beings, as authentic human beings, should not have to suffer through. Somehow we have to get back down to a more basic self, a more basic structure of really identifying who we are, and what we want to do with the rest of our lives. Otherwise, we'll suffer this anxiety forever. And it'll all be because of ego attachment. In this case, being attached to an ego that does not know itself, does not understand itself, and in many, many cases, does not like itself. And this brings us to the life in the lonely crowd. When we get to this situation, we start trying to find others that will, you can read the notes, that's fine. I'll talk over them. When we get into this kind of a situation, we often find ourselves seeking advice from others, and sometimes these others are just as lost as we are. They're just as lonely as we are. I remember when I was in my 30s, hanging out in what we used to call meat markets. Those are bars where people would go and find each other. I understand that hasn't changed much. It's just that the music's gotten louder and the drink's more exotic. But people still do it. The Friday night ritual of going out on the town to find somebody not totally sober that could find us attractive. We have people that join clubs. Name your club, Lions, Rotary, BFW, biker groups, whatever, trying to find people like us that we can emulate, people that we respect that can help us find ourselves. We join a club to identify with the club, to identify with the kind of people we think are in that club. So in this, we frantically start searching. We frantically start joining things, doing things. And that is not always bad. That can lead us to self-discovery, but quite often it leads to more anxiety. There's something almost un-American about the love of solitude that the Buddha advocated, this self-reliance. Be your own refuge. Literally become a refugee. Taking refuge in yourself, your own karma, your own vision of what you want to be when you grow up and become enlightened. It's very different than the way we have been educated. You got to be a team player. Well, there's nothing wrong with a team, but you can't take refuge in the team because the team is not dependable. I'm not terribly dependable either. But in the end of the day, at the end of my life, I'm all I got. My life is literally all about me. It's not about anybody else. You can live with a person for 1,000 years and you'll never know anything about them. You'll only know what you think about them. I like I've heard it like 50 times today, where somebody will say something and the person will respond, "Yeah, right?" How do I know if it's right or not? I can't read your mind. I'm not going to a fortune teller to tell me how to live my life or what the meaning of the universe is. Oh, and here's one of the secrets, and you find it in the Pali Canon. What is the meaning of life? There is no meaning to life until you apply a meaning to life. When you find that meaning of life, what is meaningful for you, then you will find your destiny, your purpose, and what you want to be when you grow up. There's a cool sutta, it's called the Simile of the Snake. And here the Buddha traces the tendencies of the anxious man to his inability to grasp the basic truth of egolessness, which is the key to understanding any form of anxiety. The belief in I and mine, though it can give a superficial feeling of security, is the cause of anxiety, fear, and worry. Similarly, the snake's very, very simple. Guy gets up in the middle of the night, presumably to go to the bathroom. He gets up in the middle of the night and he sees a snake crawling along the floor. He gets terrified. He knows the snake is going to bite him and it will kill him. His hands are shaking. He feels faint. His blood pressure drops. He knows it's the end. So he grabs a torch from the fire and holds it up. Maybe the light will scare the snake away. It's not a snake at all, it's a rope. In the dark, his mind pieced together a living snake from a dead rope. Sometimes I go to the bathroom at night and I see a cat following me. I have 2 black cats. I reached down to pet the cat and it was just a shadow. Where did the cat come from? My mind created the cat, just like this guy's mind created the snake that terrified him. Our whole life is surrounded by lions and tigers and bears, oh my, that we created. There are boogeymen everywhere. Be afraid. By its very nature, fear entails avoidance. And here we have that instance where people do not avoid fear. They flirt with it. That's why monster movies are so popular. Vampires have become romantic. They will kill you, but they're still beautiful and they're always young. Godzilla's even made a comeback, as King Kong has several times over. There are people that search for forms of life that will scare the hell out of them. Bungee cord jumping out of a perfectly good airplane. Riding motorcycles when they're high at 80 miles an hour down a city street. People do this all the time. Unfortunately, they probably do it more often than we know. It excites them. It stimulates adrenaline. It breaks through the monotony and boredom of everyday life. Others feel disgusted with their life and their own self, and they suffer from what Freud used to call a death instinct or a death wish. Charles Bronson made a lot of money out of the death wish. 4 movies, I think. It's possible that situations of disorder, turmoil, and violence are all fed by this ambivalent nature toward fear. Not very many years ago, there was a whole chaos movement. There was an anarchist movement. It started here in Chicago. People that were disgusted with themselves and life had no real value. So there was nothing to be afraid of. So in order to stimulate themselves, they created fearful situations. And they like to break taboos. A taboo is a vehement prohibition of an action based on a belief such that behavior is either too sacred, such behavior is either too sacred or too accursed for ordinary individuals to undertake, under the threat of supernatural punishment. Well, we've grown out of that. We don't believe in supernatural powers punishing us anymore, do we? So maybe we want to take a little risk, see if anybody up there is paying attention. Breaking a taboo is usually considered objectionable by society in general, not merely a subset of the culture, but we forgot what the taboos were originally there to do. This compulsion to flirt with fear in violating taboos, laws, and commands. If we don't know why a law or a taboo is in place in the first place, we tend to ignore it very, very often. If you live in Chicago, you see bicyclists not being very attentive to traffic laws that they're supposed to obey because they don't see how it can possibly apply to them. Well, the driver of automobiles see exactly how it can apply to them. But unless we understand the consequences of our actions, we have no fear of consequences. And when we don't know why the taboo is there, we generally believe there is no consequence. Who's going to enforce it? When desires are curbed through fear, they are repressed and emerge through other channels. If a person is afraid of breaking the law because they fear punishment, they will find another taboo to break. This sometimes manifests as the abusive husband, the abusive spouse. Women can be just as abusive as men, quite often are. But thwarted desires lead to frustration. Frustration leads to lashing out eventually. A lid can't be kept on it forever. We need to find more creative ways of expressing ourselves. The Buddha in the literature is not really concerned with the question of whether spontaneous expression of emotion is good or whether it should be inhibited. He said nothing about that. What he did talk about was self-understanding. Analyze the emotion. Gain insight to the point where the emotion doesn't become overwhelming. The problem is that we get overwhelmed with emotion. It's not a problem that we have them. The problem is we don't know how to deal with them. So he espoused shamatha vipassana, meditation. Tranquilizing the mind, calming it down so wisdom can occur. Once wisdom arises, these insights, then greater calm and clarity of mind arises. With greater calm and clarity, more insights, and it keeps going in this sort of a progression. I see my arrow moved. Can't move it back. Okay, the three aspects of disciplining emotions. We're trying to gain wisdom here. There's the development of the habit of self-observation with regard to one's emotional condition. Okay, mindfulness. This involves the control of emotional manifestations as they arise. Control, discipline. That was the second perfection. And the development of a new set of values so that the situation which earlier elicited the responses of fear will fail to do so in the future. Cognitive therapy. We literally change the way we think because now we are endowed with a clearer insights about what's really going on, and we don't have to be stupid all the time. I use that word carefully. The Buddha did call a certain class of people stupid. And in retrospect, I have the feeling he might have included me in that group. So we have to begin at the beginning. We begin with ourselves. Who else can we begin with? Because we begin with ourselves, we end with ourselves. No matter how many people are around us, we go through this journey alone. If we begin with ourselves, we don't get very excited with the emotions of fear, hatred, jealousy, and pride that we see in others. If we're working on ourselves, we don't have to pay attention to them. It's very easy to find fault in others, very difficult to find the fault within ourselves. We don't have to see our shadow self in everybody else. That's called projection, or in modern speak, the holographic mind. We can analyze the self and understand where we're coming from. And we can practice within a community that has a reciprocal effect. Fear, when generated at a social level, creates mutual mistrust, suspicion, and hatred. If I'm not feeling a threat from you, I'm not going to do anything that will antagonize you. If I'm not feeling jealous of you, you don't have to get overwhelmingly prideful. If I'm not coveting, desirous of your goods, then you don't have to worry about protecting them from me. The roots of racial prejudice can be understood in the light of this phenomenon of mutual fear. I don't trust you, you're going to pick up on that, so you're not going to trust me either. Hope in marginal faiths. This is an interesting thing I ran across. I just want to go through it very briefly, that especially in America, we have 2,432 sects of Christianity alone. We also have roughly 1,800 licensed sects of something that comes under the umbrella of the New Age movement, which began actually back in the 70s. Not talking about the broader part of it that came about in the 1830s through 1880s. But during the 70s, we got the crystal gazers, a lot of tarot readers and things like this. These marginal religions, called marginal because they're not mainstream, are sometimes based on fear, sometimes based on people trying to find themselves. And I want to say, I think they're very cool because they help the person that is going to them think out of the box. They can no longer desire to be rigidly controlled inside of this superstructure where they have to think in a certain way, have to act in a certain way, have to conform to certain forms and rituals. Now they can invent their own rituals. Now in Buddhism, this is undesirable because it's a clinging to rites and rituals, which is usually seen as a bad thing, an inhibiting thing. It inhibits us because we limit ourselves on what it is we can do with our lives. But on the other hand, this ability, this thrust to think outside of the box is very, very helpful in our growing process. And I just thought I'd throw that in. And if you want, I can throw that back out. Okay, let's go back a page here. No, that's That's it. We're done with wisdom finally. And next week we can start on aditana, determination. But actually I can probably run through this in 5 minutes, because aditana is determination, decision, resolution, self-determination, will, or vow to some people. In the old Theravadan Bodhisattva vows, the 10 perfections have these 10 aspirations that go with them. And one of them reads, "May I be firm and resolute and have an iron will. May I be soft as a flower and firm as a rock. May I never be high-principled." I like that. High-principled. Never get very full of myself, basically, is the way it's interpreted. Soft as a flower and firm as a rock. Very pliable, yet understanding what they are. So Ajahn Chah was asked, "What is the mind?" And Ajahn Chah answered, "What is the mind? The mind is anything. The mind isn't. It comes and it goes. It's not eternal. It's not even long-lasting. As soon as I change my mind, there's a new mind there." Ajahn Lee, a person I wish I would have known, unfortunately passed away before I got the chance. "The mind is neither good nor evil, but it's what knows good and evil. It's what does good and does evil, and it's what lets go of good and lets go of evil." Ajahn Chah was a heavy advocate of just letting go of everything, because good and evil are value judgment that we make from the perspective of our own ego. The Buddha said that a person has 6 properties, 6 media of sensory contact, 18 considerations, 4 determinations. We're only really interested in the determination part now. Like I said the other day, Buddhists love lists. And he has been stilled where the currents of construing do not flow. And when the currents of construing do not flow, he is said to be a sage of peace. In other words, if you're not engaged in cognitive gymnastics, you will find peace. One should not be negligent of discernment. One should guard the truth, be devoted to relinquishment, and train only for calm. This is a summary of the analysis of 6 properties. The 4 determinations that he just mentioned: determination for discernment, determination to wisely decide what you need to do, the determination for truth, what lies underneath our emotions that we just spent roughly an hour and 25 minutes talking about. The determination for truth, the determination for relinquishment, the letting go of holding on to the things that will do us harm, and the determination for calm, which will be the 10th perfection that we'll talk about next week, unless I get full of myself again. Determination for direct experience. One should not be negligent of discernment, should guard the truth, blah, blah, blah. Well, he lists 6 properties that we're supposed to be determined to experience, and they are the earth property, the liquid property, the fire property, the wind property, the space property, the consciousness property. In other words, things that we can experience directly. And you know what? I'll pick up there next week, and we can talk more about these things next week. And next week we'll talk about determination and the next 2 of the perfections. Then we'll follow that up week after next with a recap of the whole thing. So if I would have told you that on the first night, you wouldn't have shown up for the next 7, because you would have gotten it all at the end in abbreviated shorthand Cliff Note style. Any questions? Any answers? Any comments?
I have a question.
Okay.
You had talked about focusing on the self and deep looking into the self. My question is that when we see qualities in others that we don't like, I've heard of a practice where you recognize that quality within yourself.
Yeah, you wouldn't recognize a quality in somebody else unless it already pre-existed within you.
But do we realize that?
And yeah, once you, and you know, if you keep that in mind for 2 or 3 weeks, that becomes the whole practice, because then you'll never forget it. It'll always be there. Whenever you see something that you don't like and somebody else, you go, wow, that's my shadow self. And you just remind yourself of that you couldn't see it unless it didn't exist in you. And C.G. Jung called that his shadow self, or your shadow self. And I don't think C.G. Jung ever considered that he had a shadow self at all. Ego. Him and Freud. Yeah, that's one of the practices. And also the other practice is, we have to remember too that we project onto the world, that the world doesn't exist outside of the way we think of it, at least as far as our experience is concerned. There's stuff out here, but the way we experience it is totally a function of mind. So we're projecting out there. So if we see something that we find horribly disgusting, we have to realize we're the one that put it there. We're making that determination that that's what it is. And if we see it as disgusting, then it's because there's something within us that is making that judgment, and we wouldn't know how to judge it unless we were that ourselves. And very humbling experience once you do that. And that's how I got over my dislike of certain political leaders. Okay. And that brings us to 9 o'clock. If there is nothing else, good night.